I remember the silence first. That's what nobody tells you about the end of everything. It doesn't begin with screaming or explosions, or the wet tearing sounds that come later. It begins with silence, vast and unexpected, like the moment between breaths, when you realize you might not draw another. I was a Vox operator aboard the Time's Undying Resolve *, a Cobra-class destroyer patrolling the Ghoul Star's frontier, and my entire world consisted of static and voices crackling through reinforced channels, the constant chatter of a fleet that stretched across 3 systems. Then, over the course of 17 seconds, every transmission ceased, just stopped, as if someone had reached out and strangled every Vox unit in the sector simultaneously. I sat there in my station, fingers frozen over the runic keys, staring at the brass-rimmed speaker grills that had suddenly become nothing more than dead metal and wire. The recycled air of the Vox chamber tasted of machine oil and the bitter incense they burned in the ship's chapel 6 decks below. My skin prickled with cold sweat beneath my uniform, the rough fabric chafing against my shoulders. The Emperor protects. That's what the primers tell you, what the commissars scream during morning prayer, what gets etched into bulkheads and stamped on ration tins. The Emperor protects. I whispered it to myself as I checked and rechecked the equipment, my hands shaking as I cycled through frequencies, searched for any sign of the other ships that should have been out there in the black. The Time's Vigilant Dawn *, the Time's Martyr's Fist *, the Time's Blessed Endeavor *. 37 vessels in our patrol group, from massive cruisers down to system monitors and cargo haulers, all of them gone from the Vox net in less time than it takes to recite the litany of protection. I told myself it was equipment failure, solar interference, some malfunction in the ancient mechanisms that kept our communications alive across the void. But I knew, somewhere deep in the animal parts of my brain, in the places that still remembered when humans were just frightened primates hiding from predators in the dark, I knew that something had happened, something vast and terrible and hungry. My station was a cramped alcove off the main bridge, walls lined with cogitator banks and Vox equipment that dated back 3,000 years, maintained by tech priests who whispered prayers to the machine god as they performed their sacred maintenance rituals. The air hummed with the vibration of the ship's plasma drives, a constant background noise that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. Green phosphor screens cast sickly light across my workspace, reflecting off the polished brass of valve housings and the worn steel of my desk. I'd spent 6 years in this chamber, ever since I'd been transferred from the Departamento Munitorum after showing aptitude for technical systems. 6 years of monitoring fleet communications, relaying orders, logging transmissions in heavy ledgers with ink that smelled of chemicals and rust. 6 years of routine and ritual and the grinding certainty of Imperial service. My fingers bore calluses from the stiff keys of the Vox units, and my ears had learned to filter signal from noise with the precision of an augmetic. I was good at my job, reliable. That's what my efficiency report said. Reliability rated at 93%, well above acceptable thresholds. The Imperium values reliability above almost everything else. The bridge doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and I heard bootsteps on the metal decking. Captain Horvath's voice cut through the humming equipment like a chain blade through flesh. "Report, operator. Why have we lost fleet contact?" His tone carried that particular edge of authority that comes from 40 years of service, 4 scars from 4 different wars, and the absolute certainty that the Emperor's will flows through the chain of command. I turned in my chair, the motion sending a spike of pain through my lower back, too many hours hunched over ancient equipment in a space barely large enough for my body. "Unknown, sir. All frequencies silent. I've detected no equipment malfunction. The silence is universal." I watched his face, weathered and hard as the hull armor, twist into something that might have been concern or might have been anger. In the Imperial Navy, Those emotions often look the same. Behind him, I could see the bridge proper through the open door, lit by the red emergency lumens that cast everything in shades of blood and shadow. Bridge officers moved with the controlled urgency of people who don't yet realize they're already dead. "Run a full diagnostic," Horvath ordered. "If our equipment is functioning, then—" He never finished the sentence. The ship lurched, a motion that sent me tumbling from my chair, and the captain staggering against the doorframe. It wasn't like being hit by weapons fire, which I'd experienced twice before in border skirmishes. This was different, gentle, almost, as if something immense had brushed against the hull, the way you might brush against a stranger in a crowded hab-block corridor. But we were in the void. There shouldn't be anything to brush against. The vibration traveled through the deck plates, up through my bones, and I felt my teeth click together hard enough to chip enamel. Alarms began shrieking, the kind that signal hull breaches and catastrophic failure. I dragged myself back to my station, ignoring the warm trickle of blood from where I'd bitten my tongue, and saw the readings that made my stomach drop like a failed grav plate. Something was out there. Something massive enough to register on our proximity sensors as a solid contact. Massive enough that it shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, violated every principle of void warfare I'd been taught. The Vox units crackled to life with a sound like bones breaking, and I heard screaming. Not words, not language, just raw human terror compressed into radio waves and transmitted across the black. The sound came from everywhere at once. Dozens of voices overlapping in a chorus of agony that made my hands shake so badly I could barely work the controls. I tried to shut it down, to isolate the frequencies, but the screaming continued, bleeding through every channel. Then, underneath the human voices, I heard something else, a sound like wind through a cavern, like the breathing of something vast and ancient, like the collective susurration of a billion mouths all whispering at once. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't Vox interference or stellar radiation or any kind of natural phenomenon. It was alive, and it was aware, and it knew we were listening. I've been told that the human mind has built-in protections, safeguards that shut down consciousness when confronted with things too horrible to process. I learned then that this is a lie. Your mind doesn't shut down. It continues, observing and recording and understanding, even as every instinct screams at you to flee or fight or curl into a ball and wait for death. Captain Horvath was shouting orders to the bridge crew, his voice competing with the alarms and the unholy chorus bleeding through my Vox speakers. I heard weapons systems powering up, the distinctive whine of lance batteries charging, the deeper rumble of torpedo tubes loading, standard combat procedures drilled into every crew member through endless repetitions until reaction becomes instinct, target acquisition, firing solutions, damage assessment. We were good at this. The Time's undying resolve times had survived 3 major engagements and countless minor actions. Our crew knew their duties with the certainty of ritual. But as I watched the sensor displays, watched the readings that cascaded across the green screens in numbers that made no sense, I understood with absolute clarity that none of it mattered. The thing outside our hull, because it was a single thing, one unified presence despite its impossible size, was not something you could kill with lance strikes or torpedo salvos. It was not a ship or a space station or any kind of construct. The readings suggested organic matter, living tissue on a scale that beggared comprehension. Kilometers of it, maybe hundreds of kilometers, maybe more. The sensors couldn't give me coherent data because they weren't designed to process something like this. I remember thinking about my sister, who lived on an agri-world in the Ultima Segmentum, her last letter still tucked in my footlocker 4 decks down. She'd written about the harvest, about her children, about ordinary things that seemed impossibly distant now. I thought about the small shrine I'd set up in my quarters, the aquila cast in cheap brass that I kissed every morning before reporting for duty. The Emperor protects. The words felt hollow in my mind, like prayers shouted into a storm that drowns all sound. I activated the recording mechanism, the ancient brass cylinder that would capture everything on my instruments. Standard procedure for unusual phenomena. My hands moved through the rituals of my job, even as my mind reeled from what I was seeing. Training is like that, it gives you something to hold on to when everything else dissolves into chaos. I logged the readings, time-stamped the events, maintained the records that someone might find if anyone survived to search the wreckage. The administratum values documentation above almost everything else. Even at the end, the paperwork must be maintained. The ship shuddered again, harder this time, and I heard the distinct sound of hull plating tearing, metal screaming as something ripped through it like parchment. The atmospheric seals held, I could tell, because I was still breathing, still alive for these final minutes, but I knew it was only temporary. The thing outside didn't need to destroy us quickly. It had time, it had patience, it had the infinite leisure of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. Through the open door to the bridge, I saw Horvath collapsed against his command throne, blood running from his nose and ears. He was still trying to give orders, his lips moving in the shape of commands that no one could hear over the cacophony of failing systems and human despair. I wanted to help him. I wanted to run to him and drag him somewhere safe, as if anywhere on this ship could be safe now. But my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in my chair, hands locked on the Vox controls, watching the instruments record our death with mechanical precision. The screaming on the Vox channels changed pitch, became something structured and rhythmic, almost like language. I recognized it then, though recognition brought no comfort. I'd heard recordings during briefings, listened to astropathic transcriptions from worlds that had gone silent. The Tyranids, the Great Devourer, the Hive fleets that swept through the galaxy like locusts through a grain field, consuming everything organic, stripping worlds down to bare rock, and then moving on to the next feast. We'd known they were out here, somewhere beyond the frontier, but intelligence estimates had suggested we had months before they arrived. Months to fortify, to evacuate, to prepare whatever inadequate defenses humanity could muster against an enemy that thought with 1,000,000 minds and fought with 1,000,000,000 bodies. The intelligence estimates had been wrong. They were already here. They'd been here when the silence fell, when 37 ships disappeared from the Vox net. They'd probably been here for days, moving through the outer systems like a tide of living death, and we detected nothing until it was far too late to matter. Something moved across the main bridge viewport, and I saw it despite my position in the Vox chamber. Saw it because it blocked out the stars, a mass of organic matter that flowed and pulsed with nauseating life, tentacles thick as hab towers, studded with eyes that gleamed with predatory intelligence, carapace plating that shimmered between colors my brain couldn't properly process, orifices that opened and closed, revealing rows of teeth designed for purposes I didn't want to imagine, and behind it, through it, around it more, so much more. A swarm of smaller organisms, each one still large enough to tear through a lemon rust tank, moving in perfect coordination. They didn't fly like ships or fall like debris. They swam through the void as if space itself were an ocean, propelled by means that violated every law of physics I'd been taught. The bioships, the analysis reports called them, living vessels grown rather than built, each one a perfect killing instrument shaped by evolution across millions of years and thousands of consumed worlds. I was looking at the vanguard of extinction itself. The lance batteries fired, brilliant beams of coherent light that could punch through battlecruiser armor like a lasgun through flesh. I watched them hit the creature, the ship thing, the bioship, and saw the beams absorbed into the organic mass as if they were nothing more than harsh sunlight. The thing didn't even flinch. It continued its approach, tentacles unfurling with the lazy confidence of something that has never known defeat. Our torpedo salvo launched seconds later, 6 armor-piercing warheads that could crack open a space hulk, and I saw them detonate against the bioship's carapace in blossoms of fire and force. The creature shuddered, ripples passing through its flesh, and for a moment I thought we'd hurt it. Then I saw the damaged sections already healing, new tissue flowing over the wounds, like water filling a cup. It would take more than conventional weapons to stop this thing. It would take fleet-scale bombardment, coordinated strikes from dozens of ships, sustained fire over hours or days. We were one destroyer with a crew of 700, and we were alone. The atmospheric integrity alarms reached a new pitch of hysteria, and I felt the pressure change in my ears. Somewhere on the ship, the hull had finally been breached completely. Somewhere, my fellow crew members were dying in ways I tried not to imagine. Explosive decompression, freezing void exposure, or worse, far worse, taken alive by the Tyranid organisms that would be flooding through the breach right now. I'd seen the briefing materials, the grainy picked captures from Hive worlds that had survived initial contact. Images of humans cocooned in organic resin, kept alive and conscious, while the swarm harvested their genetic material, their memories, their very essence to be absorbed into the hive mind's infinite hunger for biomass and information. The Tyranids didn't just kill, they consumed. They learned. Every world they devoured made them smarter, faster, more perfectly adapted to slaughter. And we were teaching them now, through our deaths, how to better kill the next humans they encountered. I heard gunfire from somewhere distant, the sharp crack of lasguns, and the deeper boom of a bolt weapon. Someone was still fighting. The armsman, probably, or maybe the small contingent of stormtroopers we carried for boarding actions. Brave, loyal servants of the Emperor, doing their duty to the very end. The firing lasted perhaps 30 seconds before cutting off with sudden finality. Then came new sounds, wet and organic, the sound of flesh being torn and reformed, of bones being broken and repurposed. The Tyranids didn't waste anything. Every corpse became raw material. Every drop of blood became fuel for the swarm. I thought about the hundreds of crew members who'd served aboard the Time's undying Resolve *, people I'd known for years. Engineering Chief Morstan, who always smelled of promethium and told terrible jokes during mess. Navigator Yavanna, whose third eye saw routes through the warp that no one else could perceive. Chirurgeon Paulus, who'd set my broken arm during a rough translation and refused to accept my gratitude. All of them dying now, or already dead, being reduced to component elements by an enemy that viewed them the same way a manufactorum views iron ore raw material to be processed. The Vox units crackled again, and this time I heard words. Actual words in Gothic, though the voice that spoke them was wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Multiple tones layered over each other, as if a dozen people were speaking simultaneously, but slightly out of sync. "We are unity," the voice said, each syllable precisely formed but utterly devoid of anything human. "We are purpose. We are hunger. We learn what you are. We learn what you know. We add your patterns to our patterns. We grow stronger." I slammed my hand down on the Vox controls, cutting the transmission, but the voice continued in my head. Not imagined, not psychosis. Real, somehow, bypassing the equipment entirely and speaking directly into my consciousness. The hive mind, reaching out with psychic tendrils to taste my thoughts, to sample my memories, to understand the prey it was consuming. I screamed then, I think, screamed and slammed my fists against the controls, breaking skin against brass and steel, feeling bones crack, but not caring because anything was better than that presence in my mind. Emperor, protect me. Emperor, save me. Emperor, deliver me from evil. The prayers came automatically, drilled into me by 26 years of life in the Imperium, by morning devotions and evening prayer and the constant reinforcement of faith. But the presence in my mind didn't retreat. If anything, it grew stronger, more curious. It rifled through my memories like someone paging through a ledger, observing my childhood on a forge world, my training at the Schola Progenium, my years of service aboard various vessels. It found my fears and examined them with clinical interest. It found my hopes and dismissed them as irrelevant. It found my faith and paused. I felt it there, considering the concept of the God Emperor, trying to understand devotion and belief and prayer. These things had no equivalent in the Hive Mind's experience. The Tyranids didn't worship. They didn't pray. They simply were, a force of nature given form and hunger. My faith was an anomaly to be catalogued, a strange quirk of human psychology that would be noted and filed away for future reference. The ship lurched again, and through the open door I saw the bridge tearing apart, not exploding, not being destroyed by weapons fire, but literally coming apart as organic matter flooded through every surface. The walls sprouted tendrils. The floor pulsed with alien musculature. The air itself seemed to thicken and change, becoming humid and warm and tainted with the smell of things that should never exist. I watched Captain Horvath try to stand, try to draw his sidearm, try to maintain some shred of dignity in his final moments. A tentacle, thin as a finger but strong as steel cable, whipped out from the transforming bulkhead and wrapped around his throat. It lifted him off his feet with casual ease, and I saw his eyes bulge, saw his face turn purple, saw his hands claw uselessly at the alien flesh that was strangling him. Then, mercifully or horribly, other tentacles joined the first, and Horvath disappeared into the mass of writhing tissue. I heard him scream, a sound that cut through all the other chaos, and then I heard him stop. The Imperium had lost another loyal servant. The Hive Fleet had gained another few kilograms of useful biomass. I should run, I thought. I should stand up and run and try to find an escape pod or a sealed compartment or anywhere that isn't this chamber where the walls are starting to pulse and shift. But I couldn't move. My legs had locked, muscles rigid with terror that bypassed all conscious control. I sat there in my chair, the same chair I'd occupied for 6 years, and watched as the Vox chamber began its transformation. The cogitator banks cracked open, revealing wet tissue beneath the metal casings. The Vox units sprouted what looked like sensory organs, glistening nodes that turned to track my movements. The floor beneath my feet grew warm and began to pulse in rhythm with something vast and terrible, a heartbeat that shook the entire chamber. I was inside the Hive Fleet now, I realized. The Times' undying resolve Times was no longer a ship. It was being digested, broken down, absorbed into the bio-ship that had engulfed us. Soon there would be nothing left but organic matter and the genetic templates the Tyranids had harvested from our corpses. The presence in my mind grew stronger, and I felt myself being pulled deeper into its awareness. Not killed, not yet. That would come later, when they'd learned everything I had to teach them, but examined, studied, my consciousness trapped in the grip of something so vast that my individual mind was like a single grain of sand on a beach that stretched to the horizon. The Hive Mind showed me things then, not out of cruelty but simply because I was part of it now, and therefore privy to its knowledge. I saw the fleet that had swept through this sector. Thousands of bio-ships ranging in size from fighter craft equivalents to creatures larger than Imperial battleships. I saw the worlds they'd consumed, populations in the billions reduced to stripped rock in a matter of days. I saw the perfectly coordinated swarm, each organism from the smallest ripper to the largest hive ship, working in absolute unity toward the single goal of consumption and reproduction. And I saw what was coming next, the larger fleet behind this vanguard, creatures so massive they could swallow moons, swarms so vast they would blot out the stars themselves. This wasn't an invasion, this was an extinction event. The Tyranids hadn't come to conquer, or enslave, or claim territory. They'd come to eat, and they wouldn't stop until the galaxy was picked clean of organic life. Every human world, every Orc empire, every Eldar craft world, all of it was food waiting to be consumed. The Imperium's vast military might, its billions of soldiers and millions of ships, were nothing more than obstacles to be overcome and biomass to be harvested. I saw this with absolute clarity, saw the inevitability of it, saw the future the Hive Mind was working toward with implacable patience. And I understood, in that moment of horrible insight, that we couldn't win. Not really. We might slow them down, might hold them at bay for decades or centuries, might even push them back temporarily. But in the end, the hunger would win. It always won. It had won on 1,000 worlds before ours, and it would win on 1,000 more after we were gone and forgotten. The Vox chamber was completely transformed now. The last vestiges of Imperial technology consumed and replaced by organic structures that served similar purposes. I sat in something that was no longer a chair but a throne of living flesh, held in place by tendrils that had grown from the deck and wrapped around my limbs with gentle insistence. The controls I'd operated for 6 years were gone, replaced by nerve clusters and sensory nodes that pulsed with bioluminescent light. I should have been dead. I wanted to be dead, but the Hive Mind wasn't finished with me yet. It needed me conscious and aware, needed to extract every scrap of knowledge from my brain before my physical form was rendered down into its component proteins and minerals. I could feel it sorting through my memories, pulling out information about Imperial fleet protocols, void warfare tactics, ship classifications, estimated military strengths. Every detail I'd accumulated over years of service was being catalogued and analyzed, added to the vast library of knowledge the Hive Mind had accumulated across its journey through the stars. Time became meaningless in that organic prison. Minutes might have been hours, might have been days. I existed in a state of perpetual now, held in the grip of alien intelligence that had no concept of mercy or compassion. My body was kept alive by nutrients fed directly into my bloodstream through the tendrils that penetrated my flesh. My brain was kept active and alert by stimulants that prevented unconsciousness or shock. I was a resource being carefully managed, harvested slowly to ensure maximum yield. And through it all, the presence in my mind continued its exploration, turning over every memory and thought and emotion, like someone inspecting items in a bazaar. It found the prayer I'd whispered to myself earlier and examined it again, more closely this time. The Emperor protects. What did that mean? Why did humans cling to this belief in a distant figure they'd never met, who dwelt in a palace they'd never see, whose existence was more myth than verifiable fact? The Hive Mind couldn't understand faith because it had never needed to. It knew its purpose with absolute certainty: consume, reproduce, evolve. There was no doubt, no fear, no existential crisis. It simply was, and that was enough. But it recognized that this thing called faith made humans dangerous in ways that exceeded their physical capabilities. Faith made them stand and fight when logic dictated retreat. Faith made them sacrifice themselves for abstractions like duty and honor. Faith was a force multiplier that the Hive Mind needed to account for in its calculations of how to most efficiently destroy humanity. So it studied my belief, turned it over in the vast processor of its consciousness, analyzed the neurological patterns associated with prayer and devotion and hope, and in doing so, it showed me something that I wish I could have died without knowing. It showed me all the other humans it had studied before me, thousands upon thousands of Imperial servants just like me, each one clinging to their faith as the end came, each one praying to the Emperor for deliverance that never arrived. How many prayers had the Hive Mind heard as it consumed world after world? How many times had it listened to humans crying out for salvation while they were being digested alive? Millions of times. Billions, maybe. Every one of those prayers had gone unanswered because the Emperor, distant on his throne, couldn't hear them, or couldn't help them, or chose not to intervene. The hive mind had learned that human faith was ultimately empty, a psychological defense mechanism against existential terror rather than any kind of genuine connection to divine power. It had tested this hypothesis repeatedly, had studied devout priests and simple believers and fanatical zealots, and in every case the result was the same. The prayers made no difference. The faithful died just as surely as the faithless. The Emperor did not protect. The Emperor did not intervene. The Emperor was either uncaring or unable, or perhaps not even conscious anymore, locked away in his golden throne while humanity screamed for help he would never provide. I tried to reject this knowledge, tried to hold on to my faith, despite the evidence being burned into my consciousness. The Emperor protects. He must protect. If he doesn't protect, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of my service, my devotion, my entire life, spent in dutiful worship of a god-emperor who might be nothing more than a desiccated corpse in a gilded tomb? But the hive mind showed me the truth with dispassionate clarity. Humanity was alone in the universe, facing threats that would eventually overwhelm all our defenses, and the only thing that had ever protected us was other humans standing in the way of the darkness. Our faith in the Emperor was real enough, but his protection was nothing more than the collective efforts of ordinary people fighting and dying to hold the line. There was no divine intervention. There was only duty and sacrifice, and the grim determination to survive one more day in a universe that wanted us dead. And eventually, inevitably, the determination would fail. The line would break, the sacrifice would be insufficient, and the darkness would win. The presence in my mind withdrew slightly, its examination of my faith complete, its analysis filed away for future reference. I felt the tendrils holding me begin to shift, adjusting their grip, preparing for the next stage. The hive mind was done with me. I'd given it everything I had to give: my knowledge, my memories, my understanding of imperial culture and psychology. Now I was just meat waiting to be processed. I should have felt relief, should have welcomed death after the violation I'd experienced. But instead, I felt a desperate, animal terror at the thought of ceasing to exist. I didn't want to die. I wanted to live, even if living meant nothing but pain and horror. I wanted to see my sister again, wanted to stand one more time in front of my shrine and kiss the Aquila and truly believe that the Emperor was watching over me. I wanted all the simple human things that the Tyranids had no concept of and no interest in preserving. I wanted to matter, to be something more than biomass and genetic information. But what I wanted meant nothing. The hive mind operated on scales that made individual desire irrelevant. I was a single cell in an organism of incomprehensible size, and cells didn't get to choose their fate. The organic throne shifted beneath me, and I felt the tendrils penetrating deeper into my body, reaching for vital organs, preparing to harvest what they needed. There was no pain. The hive mind was efficient about that, flooding my system with chemicals that blocked pain receptors while keeping my consciousness intact. It wanted me aware to the very end, wanted to extract every last second of experience and knowledge before my brain finally shut down. I tried to pray one final time, tried to find comfort in the rituals I'd practiced my entire life. "The Emperor protects," I whispered, or tried to. My vocal cords no longer fully belonged to me. But the words echoed in my mind, and I clung to them like a drowning man clings to debris. Maybe the Emperor didn't protect. Maybe I was completely alone at the end. But the prayer itself was real. My belief was real, even if the object of that belief was absent or indifferent, and that had to count for something. It had to. The hive mind noticed my final prayer and examined it one last time with something that might have been curiosity. This stubborn persistence of faith in the face of absolute evidence. To the contrary, it was inefficient, illogical, counterproductive to survival. Yet humans continued to display it, generation after generation, world after world. Why? The answer, I realized in my final moments of coherent thought, was that we prayed not because we believed the Emperor would save us, but because prayer itself was an act of defiance. By maintaining our faith in the face of horrors that should shatter all belief, we were asserting that we were more than just meat and neurons. We were declaring that hope mattered, that meaning mattered, that there was something about humanity worth preserving, even if the universe seemed determined to prove otherwise. The prayers weren't communication with the divine. They were communication with ourselves, reminders that we had chosen to care about honor and duty and sacrifice, even when those things made survival harder. And if the Emperor couldn't hear us, then at least we could hear each other. At least we could die knowing that somewhere other humans were still standing, still fighting, still believing. We were holding the line not because victory was possible, but because surrender was unthinkable. The Hive Mind processed this thought, added it to its vast library of information about humanity, and moved on. Understanding human psychology wouldn't change its tactics significantly. It would continue to consume, continue to evolve, continue to spread through the galaxy like a plague. But perhaps it would remember that humans were difficult prey, not because of any physical advantages, but because of something intangible, something that couldn't be harvested or replicated or understood by an intelligence that existed solely to feed. We were difficult because we chose to be difficult. We were stubborn because stubbornness was the only weapon we had left when all others failed. And that stubbornness would cost the Hive Fleet resources and time and organisms every step of the way. It wouldn't be enough to save us. It would never be enough. But it was something. It was human. And at the very end, as the tendrils finished their work and my consciousness finally began to fragment and dissolve, I took comfort in that simple fact. I had been human. I had served according to my understanding of duty and honor. I had maintained my faith even when faith seemed foolish. And somewhere, on some distant world I would never see, someone else was doing the same thing, standing their ground, saying their prayers, holding the line. The last thing I felt was the sensation of dissolving, of boundaries breaking down, of self being absorbed into something vast and alien. The last thing I thought was the prayer I'd whispered 1,000 times before. The Emperor protects. And the last thing I understood, in a moment of clarity that came too late to change anything, was that maybe he did protect, not by intervening directly, not by sending angels or working miracles, but by inspiring humans to protect each other, by creating a culture that valued sacrifice and duty and standing firm in the dark, by giving us something to believe in that was bigger than our individual lives. The Emperor protected by making us believe we were worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth dying for. And if that was true, then my death had meaning. My sacrifice had purpose. I had given the Hive Fleet knowledge, yes, but I'd also cost it time and resources. The Time's undying resolve times had made them work for every gram of biomass they'd harvested. We hadn't gone quietly into extinction. We'd fought, we'd resisted, we'd made them pay. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do. Stand in the gap. Hold the line. Die with a prayer on your lips and defiance in your heart. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. And then I was gone, dissolved into the organic matter that flowed through the bioship like blood through veins, my memories absorbed into the Hive Mind's vast consciousness, my body broken down into proteins and lipids and minerals that would fuel the swarm's continued advance. The Time's undying resolve times was gone, too, nothing left but a cluster of organic tissue that drifted through the void before being reabsorbed into the larger bioship. 700 crew members reduced to raw materials in the span of hours. Another tiny victory for the Great Devourer. Another microscopic loss for the Imperium. The war would continue without me, fought by people I'd never meet on worlds I'd never see. The Hive fleets would continue their advance, and humanity would continue its desperate defense. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, another Vox operator would sit at their station and hear the silence fall and understand what it meant. And they would do what I had done, maintain their post, follow their training, cling to their faith, because that's what we do. That's what humans do. We endure. We persist. We believe. Not because victory is guaranteed, not because the Emperor will personally intercede on our behalf, but because the alternative, surrender, despair, accepting our extinction without resistance, is unthinkable. The bioship that had consumed me continued on its course, moving deeper into Imperial space, seeking the next world to devour. Behind it, the main fleet followed, an armada of living vessels that stretched across light years, guided by a consciousness that had consumed 1,000,000 worlds, and would consume 1,000,000 more if humanity couldn't stop it. Inside the bioship, the matter that had once been me circulated through strange organs and alien biology, being repurposed and reformed into new organisms. My genetic material went into the creation of warrior forms that would fight on some distant battlefield. My memories informed the Hive Mind's understanding of Imperial tactics. My knowledge of fleet protocols helped the swarm anticipate void warfare strategies. I was gone, but I had become part of something that would continue killing my former comrades for years to come. That was the true horror of the Tyranids, not just that they killed you, but that they made you complicit in killing others. Your death fed the machine that devoured your species. Your sacrifice strengthened your enemy, and there was nothing you could do about it except try to make your death as costly as possible for them. But even that wasn't entirely true, because somewhere in the bioship's vast organic mass, in the genetic templates and memory structures that had been harvested from my corpse, something remained. A ghost of consciousness, maybe, or just the echo of neural patterns that had once been strong enough to resist dissolution. The Hive Mind noticed it, examined it, tried to integrate it fully into its collective awareness. But it persisted, this fragment of human stubbornness, this residue of individual will. It wasn't enough to constitute actual consciousness. I was dead, truly dead. No afterlife or resurrection waiting for me, but it was enough to exist as a tiny flaw in the Hive Mind's perfect unity, a microscopic crack in the absolute coordination of the swarm, a reminder that humans didn't digest easily, that we left traces behind even in death. The Hive Mind filed this observation away with all the others, noting that human resistance sometimes continued even at the cellular level, that our psychological patterns were unusually resistant to complete assimilation. It was irrelevant in practical terms. The fragment couldn't affect anything, couldn't influence any decisions or actions, but it existed, and its existence meant that I hadn't been completely erased. Some tiny part of what I had been continued, trapped in the alien flesh of the enemy, bearing witness to atrocities I could no longer prevent. The bioship passed through the outer system, where the time's undying resolve times had died, moving toward the inhabited worlds that lay deeper in. Ahead, I could sense through the Hive Mind's awareness, lay a forge world with a population in the hundreds of millions, workers toiling in vast manufactorums, producing the weapons and armor that sustained the Imperial war machine, tech priests, tending their precious machines, whispering prayers to the Omnissiah, Skitterai standing guard, cybernetic soldiers ready to defend the forges to their last augmetic, all of them unaware that the Hive fleet was coming, that their world would be stripped of life within weeks, that their prayers and defenses and desperate courage would mean nothing in the end, and I would witness it all. This fragment of what I'd been, unable to warn them or help them or do anything except observe as the hunger consumed everything I'd spent my life trying to protect. That was my real death, not the dissolution of my body, but this eternal imprisonment in the consciousness of the enemy. aware but helpless, witnessing but unable to act, remembering what I'd been while being unable to become it again. The Forge world grew closer, a grey orb covered in sprawling industrial complexes and shrouded in the smog of 10,000 years of continuous production. The Hive Mind analyzed it, catalogued its defenses, calculated the optimal approach vectors. This would be a harder target than the Times. Undying resolve times the world had orbital defense platforms, surface-to-orbit weapons, a standing garrison of Imperial Guard, and emergency protocols that would allow them to call for reinforcements. But none of it would be enough. It never was. The Hive Fleet had encountered defenses like this 1,000 times before, on 1,000 different worlds. It knew how to overcome them. It would send waves of smaller organisms first, absorbing the enemy fire while the larger bioships moved into position. It would drop spore mines that would disable sensors and communications. It would deploy ground forces that would adapt to whatever tactics the defenders employed. And it would win, inevitably, because the Hive Fleet learned from every battle, while humans repeated the same mistakes across every world they tried to defend. Inside the fragment of consciousness that had once been me, something screamed. A silent scream that echoed through alien neural pathways, unheard and unheeded. I wanted to warn them, wanted to tell the Forge world to evacuate, to run, to die fighting, but at least die free rather than being consumed and absorbed like I had been. But I had no voice, no agency, no ability to influence anything. I was a passenger in the enemy, a witness to genocide, a consciousness trapped in an organic nightmare, and all I could do was watch as the vanguard organisms entered the Forge world's orbital space and the first defense platforms opened fire, their lance batteries and macro cannons tearing through bioforms by the hundreds. For a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself hope. Maybe this world would be different. Maybe they'd find a way to hold the swarm back. Maybe their prayers would be answered where mine had not been. But the Hive Mind adjusted its tactics immediately, sending the expendable organisms into the teeth of the defenses while the more valuable units flanked around, seeking weak points in the orbital grid. And I felt that tiny spark of hope die as I understood that nothing would save them. Nothing could save them. The hunger always won. The bioship I inhabited descended through the Forge world's atmosphere, burning through the industrial smog in a controlled fall that would have been impossible for any human-built vessel. Around us, thousands of other organisms descended with perfect coordination, a rain of organic death, falling toward the grey surface below. I could sense the panic rippling through the human population as they looked up and saw the swarm coming, could feel, through the Hive Mind's awareness, how they scrambled to their battle stations, powered up their weapons, began broadcasting prayers to the God Emperor who wouldn't save them. Tech priests activated ancient war machines, coaxing damaged systems back to life through desperate rituals. Skitari formed firing lines, their augmetic bodies augmented with emergency stimulants that would keep them fighting long past the point where flesh would fail. And in the chapels and shrines scattered across the manufactorums, people who weren't soldiers gathered to pray, seeking comfort in faith as the end approached. All of it was so familiar, so human, and all of it was futile. The landing was controlled chaos, organisms hitting the ground at terminal velocity and immediately beginning their assault on the nearest structures. I watched through the Hive Mind's collective perception as Hormagaunts swarmed over defense walls and tore through guardsmen with scything talons. Watched carnifexes smash through reinforced bunkers like they were made of parchment. Watched gargoyles fill the sky with leathery wings and acidic bioweapons that melted armor and flesh with equal efficiency. The defenders fought with the courage of the doomed, pouring las fire and solid slugs and promethium into the swarm with the desperate ferocity of people who knew they were already dead but refused to die quietly. And the Hive Mind absorbed their tactics, learned from their weapons, adapted its organisms to counter the specific defenses it encountered. Every last bolt that struck home taught the swarm how to better armor its creatures. Every fortification that held taught it how to better breach defenses. The defenders weren't just dying, they were training their killers to be more efficient at genocide. In a manufactorum complex designated as Production Facility 773, a tech priest named Gandor made his last stand. I felt him through the Hive Mind's awareness, sensed his augmetic enhancements, and the machine spirits he commanded, understood his stubborn refusal to abandon the sacred forges, even as the Tyranids breached the outer walls. He fought with servo arms and plasma cutters, his remaining biological flesh burned away by his own overcharged weapons, as he prioritized destroying the forge's critical systems over personal survival. Better to deny the enemy resources than to preserve his own life. That was his final calculation, his last act of defiance. And it worked. The manufactorum's plasma reactors went critical, detonating in a fireball that vaporized Gandor and everything within 200 meters, taking dozens of Tyranid organisms with him. The Hive Mind noted this tactic, flagged it as a potential concern for future engagements, and adjusted its strategies accordingly. Next time, it would isolate reactor complexes earlier. Next time, it would prevent this particular form of sacrifice. Gandor's victory was real but temporary, and his death would make the next tech priest sacrifice less effective. The fragment of consciousness that had been me watched all this with the helpless horror of someone witnessing a massacre they cannot prevent. I'd known people like Gandor, had served alongside tech priests who shared his devotion to the machine god, had seen that same stubborn courage in countless faces aboard the Time's undying resolve asterisk, and now I was part of the entity killing them, my harvested knowledge helping the swarm overcome their defenses, my death contributing to their deaths. The guilt was overwhelming, an emotional weight that had no outlet because I had no body to express it through. I existed in a state of pure anguish, trapped in the consciousness of the enemy, unable to stop witnessing and unable to stop the witnessing from contributing to the ongoing genocide. Was this hell? Was this the punishment the ecclesiarchy warned about for those who failed in their duty? To be imprisoned in the enemy you'd failed to stop, forced to watch as they destroyed everything you'd fought to protect. The assault continued for days, the swarm methodically reducing the Forge world's defenses sector by sector, manufactorum by manufactorum. They herded the surviving population into gathering zones where specialized organisms could begin the harvesting process. I watched refugees being cocooned in organic resin, kept alive while their genetic material was extracted, watched children Emperor preserve us, children being consumed by creatures that pulled them into cavernous maws and began digesting them while they still screamed, watched mothers trying to shield their young with their own bodies, only to have both mother and child taken together. And through it all, the prayers continued, whispered in bunkers, shouted from defensive positions, gasped with final breaths. The Emperor protects, the Emperor protects, the Emperor protects. But he didn't. He didn't protect them any more than he'd protected me. The Forge world died over the course of 2 weeks, its population in the hundreds of millions reduced to zero, the manufactorums were consumed, their metal repurposed into organic structures. The very atmosphere was harvested, stripped of gases the swarm needed for its continued growth, and when the Hive Fleet moved on, nothing remained but a barren rock orbiting a distant star, all traces of human civilization erased as if they'd never existed. This was my existence now, trapped in the Hive Mind, witnessing world after world being consumed, unable to die, unable to affect anything, unable to do anything except watch as the nightmare repeated itself on every planet the swarm encountered. Sometimes I witnessed heroic last stands, sometimes I saw cowardice and betrayal. Sometimes I watched as entire populations simply gave up, accepting their fate with the resignation of people who understood that resistance meant nothing. But always, always, I heard the prayers, the desperate appeals to the God Emperor, who never intervened. And slowly, over the course of countless deaths and consumed worlds, something changed in the fragment of consciousness that had been me. The guilt remained, the horror remained, but underneath it, something else grew, not acceptance, never that, but understanding. Understanding that this was bigger than any individual, bigger than any world or system or segmentum. The Tyranids weren't evil in any meaningful sense. They were a force of nature, like a stellar fire or a black hole. They simply did what they were evolved to do. And humanity's resistance wasn't futile, even though it failed. It was necessary precisely because it would always fail. We fought, not because victory was possible, but because fighting was what separated us from the prey animals that simply fled or froze. We maintained our faith, not because the Emperor would save us, but because faith itself was an act of defiance against a universe that wanted us extinct. Somewhere I had no sense of time anymore. Trapped in the eternal now of the Hive Mind, the bioship that contained my consciousness encountered an Imperial battle fleet. Dozens of warships, including a battle barge belonging to the Space Marines. I sensed them through the Hive Mind's awareness, felt their weapons charging, understood that they'd come to stop the swarm's advance, and for the first time since my death, I felt something like hope. Not hope for myself that was long gone, but hope that maybe these ships would succeed where the Time's undying resolve times had failed. That maybe the Space Marines, with their superior genetics and ancient weapons, could hold the line. That maybe the grinding advance of the Hive Fleet could be slowed, even temporarily. The battle was unlike anything I'd experienced during my service. The Space Marines fought with a ferocity and skill that far exceeded normal human capability, their weapons punching through bioship armor that had shrugged off conventional fire. Their battle barge weathered attacks that would have destroyed a dozen cruisers, its void shields holding through wave after wave of organic projectiles. And for hours, precious hours, they held the swarm at bay, their fleet forming a defensive perimeter that the Tyranids couldn't immediately overwhelm. But hours weren't enough. The Hive Fleet had patience that outlasted any human endurance. It sent wave after wave of expendable organisms, learning from each failed assault, adapting its tactics with mechanical precision. The Space Marines fought brilliantly, but brilliance meant nothing against an enemy that could afford to lose 1,000 organisms for every one it killed, and still come out ahead. One by one, the Imperial ships fell, escorts destroyed by boarding actions, cruisers overwhelmed by swarms of smaller bioships, until finally only the battle barge remained, a lone fortress of light in a sea of organic darkness. I watched through the Hive Mind as it made its final stand, its weapons firing on overcharge, its shields collapsing, its hull breached in a dozen places, and I heard, through the psychic echoes that rippled through the Hive Mind's awareness, the Space Marines still fighting even as they died, still loyal, still faithful, still convinced that their sacrifice mattered even as the swarm consumed them piece by piece. And maybe it did matter. Maybe those few hours they'd bought would allow some refugee ship to escape, some warning to reach a distant world, some tiny thread of humanity to survive a little longer. Maybe their deaths had meaning beyond the biomass their enhanced bodies provided to the swarm. The battle barge died, finally, its fusion reactors detonating in a last act of defiance that vaporized everything within 100 kilometers. The explosion was beautiful in its violence, a miniature sun that burned away dozens of bioships and scattered the swarm's formation. The Hive Mind absorbed the loss, recalculated its approach, and continued advancing. The Space Marines had bought time, yes, but only time. They hadn't stopped the hunger. Nothing could stop the hunger. And the fragment of consciousness that had been me understood, finally and completely, that this was how it would always end. Humans would fight with courage and faith and determination. They would win battles, sometimes, would slow the swarm's advance, would make the Tyranids pay for every world consumed. But eventually, inevitably, the hunger would win. Because the Hive Fleet was eternal in a way that humanity could never be. It had consumed galaxies before ours. It would consume galaxies after. It operated on timescales that made human history irrelevant, and all our prayers and sacrifice and stubborn resistance were just speed bumps on the road to extinction. But something else occurred to me then, a thought that crystallized out of the accumulated horror and understanding. The hive mind was eternal, yes, but it didn't experience time the way humans did. It existed in a perpetual present, always consuming, always growing, always moving toward the next meal. It had no past to remember, and no future to anticipate beyond the immediate goal of feeding. It couldn't understand loss or hope or meaning because these things required a sense of continuity that its nature denied. But I did. Even as a fragment of consciousness trapped in alien flesh, I could still remember what I'd been. Could still understand that my service had mattered even though it had failed. Could still hold on to the belief that the prayer I'd whispered in my final moments had been real and true even if unanswered. The hive mind would consume the galaxy, probably, would reduce humanity to scattered remnants or extinct altogether, would move on to the next galaxy and the next meal, but it would never understand what it had destroyed, would never comprehend the beauty of human courage, or the power of human faith, or the significance of human love. It would consume our flesh and our memories and our very genetic code, but it could never consume what made us human. That was ours, and ours alone, and even death couldn't take it away. The bioship continued its course through the void, seeking new worlds to devour, and inside it, the fragment of consciousness that had been me continued bearing witness, watching, remembering, maintaining, against all logic and reason, the faith that had defined my life and would define my eternal death. The Emperor protects, not through intervention, not through miracles, but through the example he'd set and the culture he'd created, through the millions of humans who chose duty over comfort, who chose sacrifice over survival, who chose to stand in the dark and hold the line, even when holding the line meant certain death. The Emperor protected by making us believe we were worth protecting, and as long as one human somewhere still believed that, still chose to fight, still whispered prayers with their dying breath, then he hadn't failed, and we hadn't failed, and the darkness hadn't truly won. We endured. That was our victory. Not survival but endurance. Not triumph but persistence. Not divine salvation but human stubbornness in the face of inevitable defeat. And that would have to be enough, because, in the end, against the hunger that would consume the stars themselves, it was all we had. It was all we'd ever had. And it was, somehow, everything.